So it's November 24th. Happy Thanksgiving. I'm going to be giving a critique of the debate. I'll try to keep it quick. So I'm going to begin with Sam. Sam on the 1AC. So, some of the judges said that there is potential weakness in your case, in the harms that you develop in your opening speech. I think that you do develop harms, but I think that actually you add something new into the debate here, which potentially becomes, because you leave something implicit, becomes a problem for the rest of the debate. So it seems like your harm is this. You read us the guidelines, and then you say that employers are not following these guidelines, and that therefore the responsibility for enforcing these, because the regulatory mechanism doesn't really exist, the employers don't have an interest in enforcing the guidelines, it falls onto the employees. And this presents a problem because the employees are forced into silence because they feel like they need this for future employment. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't have a lot of power. So we need regulative action in order to enforce these guidelines. That's the point that kind of becomes a problem, right? Because it's like if the non-enforcement of the guidelines are the problem, then your plan just kind of eliminates the guidelines. So it's kind of a technical point, but the way of framing your solvents, or the way of framing your inherency is a little complicated here. Because if the inherency is tied to something that you're making obsolete, right? So the inherency is tied to the problem of enforcing these laws that we make obsolete by the plan. Technically, your plan doesn't solve for that. It just eliminates that kind of problem, and it's not clear why it's a problem, except if we're in the status quo still, right? It's only a problem to not be able to enforce the law if that law is needed. And really what you're doing is passing a new law that makes that law not needed anymore. So you need to re-describe what the inherency is, not in terms of the non-enforceability of the law, but in what is the effect of the non-ability to enforce that law. And it's that part that is not so clearly articulated in the first speech, which I think leads your judges to some confusion about what the harm is. You do add something interesting in here, though, and here's how I see what I think you're imagining. Because when you also talk about how the status quo also allows corporations to take advantage of the paid internships, and I think that your argument goes something like this. Because in the status quo, interns are happy just to have a paid internships because this is like above the standard, that therefore the paid interns can be abused by doing kind of menial tasks, not really getting an education. And if the minimum is set in such a way that everyone is paid, everyone will kind of demand more. And there's a lot of implicit assumptions here about why that would happen. There might be assumptions about human nature, that humans always demand more than the minimums. Sometimes people call this the Pygmalion effect, right? So wherever we set the bar, people will only well, I guess if it's a minimum, it's not quite the Pygmalion effect. But if we set a minimum here, people are only going to demand so much more. If we set the minimum here, people are going to demand more than that. So if we need people to demand more, we need to set the minimum higher, something like that. But I think also what's interesting here is that you're thinking about the nature of interns, or the nature of an internship, really in terms of labor here, not in terms of kind of the educational effect. But you're still kind of hinting at that with the reading of the guidelines. So there's a bit of a tension in your case. Should we really just kind of treat interns as a kind of labor and regulate it in that way? Or should we kind of try to pass legislation that will preserve this idea of an educational effect, right? And I think that there are moments in your case where it's not really clear what you're looking for. So when Megan ends up arguing in the second affirmative that in the fashion industry, there aren't even going to be jobs for the interns to take, this clearly seems to be a place where we should treat internships like labor. Because if you're specializing in fashion and there's not going to be a job, it would be wrong to kind of treat this as an educational experience. It's just kind of a general work experience, right? So one strategy here would be to say, really the skills that we need for the kind of marketplace we have now aren't necessarily geared towards particular kinds of specialization. It's not the white-collar version of the apprenticeship. It's kind of a general workplace familiarity, which is what you're getting from the internship. And maybe you would argue something like, in order to get your education and your labor cake too, you might want to say, the kind of education that you need now is dependent upon being kind of fully integrated in the workforce with payment, with all of the kinds of things that are attendant upon that. And so really what what we really do want for college students or postgraduate students is just a labor experience that they have a certain kind of access to because of the term internship or whatever this will mean. But at this point, it does kind of seem like it's unclear as to why we would still be using the term internship at all. And this becomes a slippery moment in the debate, and that's not necessarily your fault. But it's something I think that you could take a more kind of principled stance on, so that we're not kind of confused about should we treat interns in terms of an educational value or should we treat them in terms of labor value. If those go together, we need to hear how right away in the first speech. Okay, so when it comes time for the cross X, I think that you do a good job, Sam, when you get this kind of question. I think it's from from Dylan, sorry. When Dylan says, I don't understand, if you're substituting this for an art class, how is this unfair for the credit argument, right? Which is maybe not the strongest argument to attack here at this point, but you say, I see your point, but my real point is concerning the amount of time that you're spending and why this is more valuable. I think this is the right approach to the cross X, and to concede something like, oh, I can see why you might think that there is a kind of exchange here, but what I'm saying is disproportionate. And you just restate your argument, right? What I'm saying is disproportionate is the amount of time that you're spending, and this is what's really valuable to students. Yeah. Okay, so first negative constructive, so this is Stephen. So Stephen, I think that you do a good job in laying out the values of the different values that interns have when they're going into the workforce, right? So it's experience, specialized field. But this is, I think there's a moment where we're kind of confusing the evidence with the argument, right? The evidence is not the argument. The evidence is not the argument. So we have to hear how the values of interns in whatever year this was taken. And I don't know about it. No one asks about recency so far in our debates. Like, when was this poll taken? Because I mean, if you said it, I didn't know. And it seems like it could change with time, right? Why do these values matter? And it might seem obvious to you. It might be like, it matters because what we should value is what the interns want out of their experience. And we shouldn't assume that they are only getting something because the way that Sam describes it, they are forced into silence by the system. No, right? But if you make this explicit, it just automatically becomes more powerful because your audience now sees where you stand. So even though they might assume that as to be the power of the evidence, they also know that that's the same kind of position that you have in relationship to this evidence. And it shows where it rebuts or where it comes into contact with the first affirmative speaker. So you need to show where the evidence becomes effective. What argument is it in response to, rather than just kind of laying it out. Yeah. So, I think, okay, so in cross-examination, here's an important point. This is directed mostly towards Megan. Popularity of fields. Megan, you kind of asked this question. You're like, the popularity of these different fields play into the high demand, which is part of the high demand for these internships, which means that there are like many more people wanting an internship in certain fields, like are all the ones that he mentioned in one of his arguments. Therefore, they have kind of what I would call a reserve army of labor, right? A reserve army of labor that they can choose from, which means that because there's so many people competing, they can offer unpaid internships. But the way that you ask this question is a little bit confusing. So then Stephen says, well, yeah, healthcare is pretty popular, so I guess that could be a cause. So Stephen has misunderstood your question, right? Stephen concedes that healthcare is popular, whereas what you're saying is that it's precisely its popularity that leads to there being this kind of reserve army of labor. So I think that, but once Stephen kind of responds with this, you just kind of nod your head and move on. And you bring it up later in your speech. But I think that this is a lost opportunity for you. So I think a better way to go is to stagger the questions in a kind of cross-examination style and say, so the fields that you mentioned where there are more unpaid internships, yes. do you know if there are more? Are there fewer or more students that apply for these internships? Stephen says there are more, there are fewer, or I don't know. If he says, as you assume, there are more, then you would say, okay. Then answer your question. If he says, I don't know, you could say, well, what do you think? Don't you think that maybe that these are more popular fields? Yes. Either way, you get a concession out of him, right? So, okay, so these are more popular fields. That would then mean, right, that there are more people applying for the same single internship on average. Yes. Therefore, don't you think it would make more sense for a company who has a lot of people who want one position that they could kind of, more people would want it, they could offer more unpaid internships? Then now he has to come up with an answer. By staggering the question in a couple steps, it gets you to a place where you don't have to, in a convoluted way, kind of state a bunch of claims and then try to turn it into a question, because if he's confused by that, it just looks like you asked the question poorly, rather than that he's unable to answer a difficult kind of point that you're making. So you kind of want to stagger your claims in such a way that each claim builds part of the or each question builds part of the claim that you want to be able to make in your next speech, rather than just kind of letting him get away with a confused answer and you nodding your head. Okay. All right, so in your speech, Megan, I think that you shouldn't start in this way. We are the affirmative. Okay. You should start right away with something like powerful. The way to open your speech is you want to think about it as a way of changing the flavor of whatever we've just tasted, right? So the intro is in a debate when we're having speech after speech after speech is like the sorbet between a dish, right? You want to say, my dish is going to be much better than the last thing that you heard because it was your opponent, right? And you want to kind of change the flavors. You might, maybe this is where you tell a story, or this is where you say, really this debate is going to be about this, blah, 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 blah. Or you're like, my opponent didn't answer the most crucial point of my partner's first speech, da, 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 da. You want to go in with something right away where you're grabbing your audience's attention, and you want to change the tone. And then this is kind of a rhetorical point. So, right, contrast is a great guide here. If you're, somewhere in the rhetoric, Aristotle says, if your opponent is serious, you should be lighthearted. If your opponent makes a joke, you should be grave. Right? So you want to be in contrast to the style of your opponent. And I think in this debate we don't have much kind of stylistic contrast, which makes it even more difficult to potentially follow some of the places where the clash isn't really well established, right? So if you can't you should always kind of try for some stylistic differentiation from your opponents. But this also is especially effective when it's not clear exactly where the arguments are meeting up. So if you sense that, go for style right away. Okay, so without getting into each specific argument, I think you're getting kind of listy here. You just give us a bunch of arguments and don't kind of give us a frame to consider them. So you're like, you have the ice cream intern, we have the Columbia not offering credit, we have possible harassment problems. So we have just a bunch of different stuff. And I think what you want to do is if you do just kind of have a list of arguments, you would still want to be able to structure them as rebuttals to other arguments. You're going to say, so I'm going to do rebuttal. So he makes this point, response. He makes this point, response. He makes this point, response, right? So if you can find a way to take this kind of massy, listy information and attach it to one point of, at least some points of your opponent, it at least still kind of has a coherent structure as rebuttal, right? And that is easier to follow, even though that seems like a really simple thing to do. That's easier to follow for an audience than just kind of a list of arguments, because we're not sure where they are in the debate. Are they working as offense for you? Are they building up your partner's case, rebuilding your partner's case? Are they new arguments, right? Where do they fall in the debate? If you just structure it as rebuttal, it's more powerful and it's easier to see the organization there. Okay, I do think that the argument about the internship as a potential risk to the business is interesting. And you say it's not safe because it might kind of like slow down productivity to train someone. But there's a potential argument here which is like, why would this be different with either paid interns or with just wage laborers, right? So I think there are some places here where you open yourself up to potentially a turned argument, where you could say, okay, she says it's unsafe to have an unpaid intern who is a risk to a business because they slow down productivity. How much worse that not only are they slowing down productivity, but we have to pay them, right? So these are kind of arguments that could be turned, and I think this is what your judges are pointing to when they're saying, in some ways, you're just arguing against internships. And so you have to be very careful in like what arguments you deploy. You want to always be able to bring it back to your plan. Like, our plan will solve this problem, or this is a benefit that will come once we pass our plan. If you can't connect it to the plan, it shouldn't be in the debate. Okay, so second negative constructive. Dylan. Okay, again, you begin by saying, I am on the negative. And here, I think we have, again, a kind of, though you're very clear and honest in this debate, but you kind of bring into language some of the problems that emerge in the kind of non-clash in the debate around the plan. Because you say at the very beginning of your speech, I am on the negative, which opposes or which supports, unpaid internships. No, you don't need to support unpaid internships. You need to oppose the plan, right? Which may mean you don't actually have to support unpaid internships. You may, but I think that this is what takes you away from the attack of the plan, is that you spend a lot of energy supporting unpaid internships. You could imagine there's a possibility that you could be against unpaid internships and still be against the plan, right? You could say, yeah, we think that unpaid internships have all of the bad things that they have, but their plan's even going to make it worse for some reason, right? And you have some kind of arguments to this effect. So I think that you want to just be really careful about understanding what your burden is in the debate. The negative has to oppose the plan. If they introduce a counter plan, they have to defend their plan. But the negative basically just has to be against the plan. And this is not just kind of like a weird debatey rule. It's so that we have kind of clear clash in the debate. It's so that we are able to see precisely where the different disagreements are going to happen. So, yeah. Be careful with that. So, yeah, I think that your, as it was said before, the vividness of your examples was really good. Your style is like very informal and nice and quite persuasive, you know? I think that your style was very engaging in this debate when sometimes we were kind of getting lost in kind of lists of information. You were good at doing a good job of engaging your audience in this debate. And I think that this is an important part of why the negative team won, because of the kind of engaging style that you showed, particularly in this speech, in the second negative constructive. So, but I think that there's one argument that you have about the advantage for the job application. You say, employers will see the unpaid internship as a sign of work ethic and interest, and it will make you more attractive for a company. That's a reasonable argument. I can see why you would say that. However, they have already shown, they have already claimed that the unpaid internship doesn't make people significantly more attractive to companies, right? In your rebuttal speech, you bring up this 2%. And I think this is like the best moment of rhetoric in the debate. One of the best moments we've seen in any of the debates where like, that 2%, you know, in this room is really small. So that 2% at the level of all of those people that are potentially, you know, going out into the labor market with internships, that's thousands and thousands of people. It's not insignificant. This is when you need to make that argument, though, right? You need to make that argument right here as part of your rebuttal, being like, it's not insignificant. And here's the reason why there's a kind of significant factor. Here's the kind of rationale from the company side. Together, those arguments are really powerful. So I think that should just be together, because you don't want to make an argument which belongs in response to another argument in the debate without making it seem like it does. Because if you have an attentive audience, and you should want an attentive audience, and they can see that, they may like judge your argument in relationship to your opponent's argument, and then you haven't brought them into connection to each other. And even if you would win still, if you did bring them into connection, the fact that you didn't may make you seem like, may make the argument seem weaker. So you should always take a relevant argument from your opponent and compare it to your argument and show why your argument is stronger. Okay, so negative rebuttal. So Sam, you bring in the lawsuits here right in the beginning of the negative rebuttal, and I kind of already mentioned this. This was not explicit in the first negative constructive, you use this as, oh, I'm sorry. blah, 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 blah. Ignore that. Dylan, you bring up the lawsuits here, and you point to why, how your opponents bring it up, but they never give any of the details. I think that this is right, as I was just kind of saying, but I don't think that this is the place that you should begin your rebuttal. I think you need to tell us like the points of clash, right? You're kind of running into the kind of as if you're still giving a rebuttal speech in the constructive, but here this is the final speech in the debate from the negative side. We want to hear what we will be voting on, and I think that you just kind of are continuing your last speech, and that might be because you guys decided not to switch, and so Steven's not giving the speech. That's fine, but I think that you need to recognize that this is a distinct genre of speech. This is like a whip speech, right? And that gets a little lost here, though you make the nice kind of 2% claim, and you also make what's a problematic claim for me, which is that it's kind of a wash that all the benefits for unpaid internships are available for paid internships, and this is not going to win the debate for either team, but it still certainly doesn't win the debate for you, from my perspective. So we really need that kind of whip speech that shows what argument you're winning on and why that argument wins the debate. That's what we need. Okay, so the affirmative rebuttal, Sam, I think that you also begin with something that isn't really isn't a strong point to begin with. So you say that there are certain benefits of paid internships, but yeah, and that this is what you're claiming is the benefits of paid internships, and they all revolve around money, and that this is kind of extra financial aid. And this seems different from what you guys were claiming before, which is so it's not clear to me at which point in the debate. At one point in the debate, it seems that what's the importance of the plan is to stop the kind of abuses that are happening from companies. At one point, the purpose of the plan is to respond to a changing labor market where the markets with unpaid internships no longer really have jobs to offer at all. So there's no possibility for kind of training. And at other points, this kind of like gap measure for students that are unable to afford certain amenities that are necessary for life because they don't have unpaid internships. I don't know why at the end you're going to put all of your eggs in the one basket. I think that a better thing to do would be like to take all of these, there even were a couple others that you had, and say, here are all of the benefits, and here are all of the benefits of our plan, here are all the problems it solves. And here's how they have responded to us, and here's why we still win. I think that you shouldn't kind of put all your eggs in one basket at the end, unless it's very clear that you have lost all of the other possibilities. And I don't think that you have at this point. I think that, the idea that this might stop certain abuses, though it hasn't really been well developed in the debate, could still potentially be something that's important to the judges, right? Okay, so final thing I'll say, the final point here about the number of internships is growing, and they're not easy to regulate. So therefore, we should pass this new plan. Kind of takes us back to that initial problem that you were trying to solve, or what it seemed to me like you were trying to solve. And I think that this is fine, but I still think that you need to give maybe something that's a little bit more weighty than a difficulty to regulate. Because I think this speaks to what your judges are saying, like, this doesn't seem like that much of a harm. Like, difficulty to regulate just doesn't have the kind of rhetorical power to seem like, let's act now because of difficulty to regulate, right? It's that other part, which is like, what happens because of the difficulty to regulate. So here's a kind of moment where the rhetorical power is really essential, right? The kind of vividness of an image. And your judges kind of pointed to the vividness of the WD-40 example. And so this might be something this might be a moment where you kind of paint a picture for us of the world under the plan and the world in the status quo, right? And you may incorporate some of those images. So you might say something like, under the status quo, we have, every once in a while, a success story like WD-40, but mostly what we have are people like my friend who are unable to even afford the basic amenities. So judges, if you want that world, please vote for the negative. However, under our plan, we have a world where everyone is paid justly, where the abuses of companies don't stop, and where we believe those opportunities for interns and businesses alike will continue to be there, and where we'll have a better trained workforce in the future. Judges, it's up to you. The end, right? And so by kind of pulling in their images and putting it next to your own, you can kind of paint the picture of a world, and this makes it easier for the judges to see what the meaning of the images of your opponent are, right? So it's kind of a foreground, background of images might be the strategy to take here. If really what you determine at the end of the debate is that what's really powerful in the debate are the images that have been offered. So that should be what you do rather than kind of point to your initial solvency. So I think that this was a good debate, even though I've offered mostly criticism. I think this was actually a very good debate. Though there were kind of moments where opportunities for clash were missed. But I think that you had interesting arguments. I think that you did a good job with kind of figuring out the format. And I think that mostly some of the things that seemed to the judges like things weren't happening were adjustments to a format that is very difficult. But I think overall you did a very nice job. So good job.